Thank you, Debbie. I appreciate that. I'd like to thank the program committee and Debbie for asking me to speak at the conference today. It's a real honor for me to speak back at my alma mater today. And I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful job the students have all done with their research projects, just the passion that you guys show for our profession and the diligence that you've exhibited for putting your talks together. Debbie and Kathleen have done an incredible job with the school, carrying on the great work that Tenwek did before you guys. So I'll be talking today about my mission experience in Eastern Africa at Tenwek Hospital over the last 16 years. This hospital that I'm going to be speaking about today is the same hospital that Bob Groom is at that he spoke about earlier. We started there about 16 years ago. And I helped set up the program while I was at Vanderbilt. And Bob joined us some years later, like around 2010, maybe 2012, I think, and was instrumental in having him be a full-time perfusionist at Tenwek Mission Hospital for our team. I became involved at Tenwek Hospital while working at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital in Nashville. Dr. Mike Liskey on the left was a pediatric cardiologist at Vanderbilt, and Dr. Russ White in the center is the chief of surgery at Tenwek Hospital. And they were medical school friends that had a common idea and vision to provide cardiac surgical service to the more than 600,000 Kipsigis natives surrounding Tenwek Hospital in Bomet Province, Kenya, where Dr. White is a missionary hospital. In 2007, Dr. Liskey and the Vanderbilt cardiothoracic team with Dr. David Michel, shown on the right, he was our pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon, and myself started planning our initial visit to Tenwek Hospital. And 1 year later, in 2008, I was able to pump the very first open heart procedure at Tenwek Hospital. Over the years, as members of our Vanderbilt clinical team moved on from Vanderbilt to other academic centers across the country, they would continue returning to Tenwek Hospital for our annual cardiac camps. And the list of hospitals here illustrates the diversity of the centers just 4 years after we started the first open heart procedure in 2008. We initially took 25 to 28 clinical and biomedical staff with us when we had to train every specialty. Today, the teams are around 18 to 20 people, since Tenwek Hospital staff are doing the majority of the clinical work during the annual cardiac camp. And Tenwek Hospital is now the largest open heart center in Kenya, performing adult open heart procedures completely on their own. When we visit each year now, our focus is on pediatric open heart procedures. Tenwek Hospital was established in 1937 by World Gospel Mission, and it's a medical ministry of the African Gospel Church there in Kenya. It's a 400-bed teaching and referral hospital and is one of the largest faith-based mission hospitals in Africa. It provides primary health care to 600,000 Kipsigis people within a 30-kilometer radius of the hospital and over 1 million people in the southwest region of Kenya. It's a surgical referral center for nearly 8.5 million people on the continent, and there are currently 5 operating rooms performing 5,000 surgeries and 10,000 endoscopies annually. And we also started doing interventional cardiology procedures within the last 4 years. The demographics of the area are its location about 55 miles south of the equator in the southern hemisphere. The population is just over 55 million. The life expectancy at birth in 2021 was just over 61 years, and 78% of the people live in rural areas with 22% in urban areas. The official language is English, and the national language is Swahili, with the local language being Kiswahili for the Kipsigis natives. 86% of the people are Christian and 11% are Muslim. And there's also a 3% indigenous traditional beliefs, which include witch doctors. A lot of our patients will come into the operating room and the witch doctors would have looked them over, and they'll make small incisions over the heart or over the spleen or whatever organ location they think is causing the child a problem. And then they rub ashes in it from the fire, so we'll have incisions that are scarred over, and they're usually on the right organ. This is the video is just a slow motion video that I took on our way to Tenwek Hospital just to show how the local people live. Tenwek has its own dedicated hydroelectric dam to provide electricity to the hospital, and it was completed about 50 years after Tenwek was founded. And this walk to the dam is one of the favorite walks for the clinical teams that come to the location. It's absolutely beautiful there. Preparations begin 4 to 6 months prior to our travel date and include monthly Zoom calls to discuss all the pertinent logistics being handled by the Samaritan's Purse logistics coordinators. And all of our travel to Eastern Kenya is handled through Samaritan's Purse. Everyone on the team are assigned responsibilities to procure specific devices, medications, and/or disposables that are required for use during our cardiac camps. Prior to departure, the entire team gathers for what we call a packing party to assemble all the needed supplies that we've gathered into 35 or 40 suitcases, which are distributed to the appropriate medical staff visiting during the specific week the supplies are anticipated to be needed in Kenya. And this photo was one that was taken at our home in Nashville prior to leaving on one of the annual trips. We rely on our travel clinics at our academic centers to know the CDC and the endemic requirements for the area that we travel to, and to verify which vaccines are needed prior to our trips. For my first trip, I needed 5 to 6 vaccines, which ran around $600 to $700. And then subsequent years, we are typically focused on PRN boosters that are necessary, or any other new requirements that have gone into effect, such as COVID-19. All members of our teams are on daily anti-malarial prophylaxis while serving at Tenwek Hospital. Malaria is less of a problem at the altitude the hospital is at, but when we go on safari following our work at Tenwek, it's at a lower altitude and the mosquitoes are a problem there. So everyone typically sleeps under a mosquito net at the hospital and while on safari. It takes our team about 3 full days of travel from the US before reaching Tenwek Hospital. We fly to an international airport somewhere in the States and lay over in either Amsterdam or Dubai, depending on the airline, and arrive at Jomo Kenyatta Airport in Nairobi around midnight local time after 30 to 36 hours of travel. Our first night is in Nairobi, which is our first chance to shower and actually sleep in a bed. The following day, we leave by van for a 4.5-hour trip to Tenwek Hospital, stopping along the way for groceries and supplies that we might need while we're there. So Kenya is on the eastern border of Africa, approximately 50 miles south of the equator at an elevation of 7,000 feet. It's slightly smaller than Texas with twice the population. The climate's very moderate, as Bob said. It's pleasant year-round, between 50 degrees at night and 70 to 80 degrees during the day. And this photo is of the Great Rift Valley as we drive down from Nairobi down the escarpment into the Great Rift Valley where the hospital is located, and it's just an absolutely amazing sight. Y'all need to try it sometime. Our final preparations occur on site after our arrival at Tenwek. Sunday evening before our first clinical day, everyone gathers for a cardiac conference where all the patients are presented and decisions are made on which patients will be operated on and in what order. We're only able to operate on those patients who can obtain a complete surgical repair with one surgery. Stage repairs such as single ventricles requiring, say, a Norwood with a bidirectional Glenn and Fontan progression just cannot be done. We're never really sure if the patient will come back at the time they need the next stage repair or if a team will be available to do it. So we can only operate on 9 to 10 patients per week, and there are anywhere from 150 to 250 families on site when we arrive, hoping and praying that their child will be operated on by our team. In 2008, preparing for our first case was like planning to do open heart surgery in your kitchen. We didn't have anything we needed for surgery at the hospital and had to bring everything with us halfway around the world. As you can imagine, preparation for the first several visits that we made were very stressful. We knew there were supplies at Tenwek, but they were donated by hospitals from all around the country, and we had no idea what supplies were donated or what would be there at the hospital when we arrived. The year prior to our first trip at Tenwek, 9 total open heart surgeries were performed in Nairobi during the entire prior year. Our first week at Tenwek, we did 10 open heart procedures. So we were able to do a whole year's worth of open heart procedures in our very first week. And when we go there, we usually go for 2 weeks, doing 9 to 10 cases per week. During the first several years, our supplies were just laying in the corner of the room, and we had to open 3 to 5 packs to find enough tubing connectors to set up the pump. And that was very stressful for me because I'm one of those very organized perfusionists that likes to have everything where it should be, and we had no idea what was in any of the packs. The first few years were very stressful. It took us 3.5 hours to set up the pump, which was a problem if urgent emergent bypass was required for any reason. And we typically worked from 5:30 in the morning until 3:30 the following morning, and only got about 3 to 4 hours of sleep per night for the first several years. Nothing is disposed of at Tenwek, as you can see from these photos, because the supplies are so scarce. And like Bob said, we'll reuse cannulas there 10 to 12 times. Practically everything is reused and sterilized, including the cloth surgical drapes and most everything else that we would normally dispose of in the United States. Very different operating conditions from what we have here in the US. When we started there, we used a pieced-together Cope Century pump. I'm not sure if many of you have ever used that, except maybe Steve and some of us older perfusionists. With the Soren Capps arterial pump during our first several years, I've done more hand cranking in Africa than any other where else in my career. We brought our own oxygen analyzers to verify sweep gas mixtures so we could be able to tell when and if the oxygen supplies froze up during bypass. And we were also using soft shell venous reservoirs as that was what was available to us in those early years. In 2012, we got 2 used Soren Capps heart-lung machines with dual cardioplegia roller heads from Bob Groom's practice at Maine Medical Center, which was a huge upgrade for us. In 2012, I was able to use custom tubing packs that I had designed specifically for Tenwek. The packs were manufactured in the Netherlands, flown to Jomo Kenyatta Airport in Nairobi, and then the Terumo distributor would pick them up and drive them to the hospital after paying all kinds of taxes, including poison tax on them. We utilized the Terumo FX oxygenators, which allowed us to continue using arterial line filters without having to independently inventory them. In 2021, Cincinnati Children's, the hospital I was working at, donated a Spectrum M4 monitor, so we were able to do electronic charting for the first time, which was just crazy compared to the working circumstances there in eastern Kenya. And we were able to see inline variables such as DO2, PO2, PCO2, and saturations, which was just really a godsend for our cases and our patients. In 2012, we had a perfusion training program at Vanderbilt, and I was able to take one of my students, Johnson, with me, and this is a picture of him doing one of his first, he was doing his pediatric rotation in Kenya, and this is a picture of him doing one of his first pediatric open heart procedures while he was there. Johnson ended up being a really good friend of mine, and he's originally from Ghana, so I was hoping that if I took him to Kenya, maybe he would be enamored with the program and maybe stay and be part of the ongoing program. But he's back here in the States with us now. In the early days, our heater cooler was a bucket of ice with a submersible pump. And before we were able to get an ice machine at the hospital, the staff would freeze water and ketchup and salad dressing bottles and bring them into the hospital every day for us. And during my last visit there in January of this year, I was fortunate enough to do a HIPEC procedure. It's one of my least favorite procedures to do, and we just happened to do one while we were there. And of course, they didn't have the appropriate equipment for it. So we were able to maintain the hyperthermic recirculation temperatures during the HIPEC recirculation period by taking an electronic tea maker from my kitchen and boiling water and dumping it in our Sarnes heater cooler and pushing the overtemp button for an hour and a half to keep it from shutting off. And the patient did very well. The Kenyan blood supply is 25% positive for HIV, 35% positive for hepatitis C, and about 3% for syphilis. So we do have to be careful with handling the equipment or the blood while we're over there. We would bring laptops and color printers on every trip to revise policies, print perfusion records and perfusion calculators, and most items could not be found on subsequent trips in the early years before they actually started doing cases on their own because they would be repurposed somewhere else at the hospital. We've developed a 58-page Tenwek-specific perfusion policy for the team that we use to minimize variance and optimize perfusion outcomes. And this past year, I was able to bring tablets for the perfusion team to use so we could download all the policies and procedures, as well as cannula flow charts, and I brought about 120,000 published articles. So as you can imagine, in that part of the country, the team has really outdated phones, and they try to do everything on their phones, but the screens are cracked. They don't get good reception. So being able to have a tablet with all of that information on it, including a perfusion calculator and an Excel spreadsheet, they can enter data real time during the case for post-dilutional hematocrits and calculate all kinds of different parameters. And the abstract that we just sent in that Bob talked about in his presentation was about using these tablets to minimize variance and optimize patient outcomes. So keep your eye open for that when it gets published. Packed red blood cells are not readily available, so whole blood is used primarily, and whole blood there has a hematocrit of 16 to 24%. And as far as the inventory of supplies go, we were never really able to maintain a complete and accurate inventory of what was at the hospital because other cardiac centers were coming to do open heart cases. We didn't know what supplies of ours they were using or what supplies they were bringing. So every time that we showed up at the hospital, we just hoped that we had everything we need. So as I said earlier, Bob Groom joined our program, I believe around 2012, and it was the first time that there was a full-time perfusion influence on site. And Bob was instrumental, as he talked about in his talk, about starting the perfusion training program. And when I was there last January, we received notification that the program was accredited, which was great news. And it's very gratifying to see the progress we've made in perfusion at Tenwek. In the initial years, I thought perfusion would be a weak link because if we didn't have a full-time perfusionist there, because the perfusion students were CRNAs and they do a phenomenal job, but I couldn't imagine having perfusion students basically running the cases without a certified or fully trained perfusionist there. So having Bob there has made all the difference in the world, and we're really proud of how the program has advanced. So some of these folks were on the slides that Bob showed. Ignatius, Aaron, and Philip, shown left to right, were all students of ours and are currently staff perfusionists. And then, as Bob said, just last March, the two girls in the back row were our first female graduates from the perfusion training program, Mercy and Daff Rose. So to give you an idea of the annual income from this part of Kenya, this video on the left is a video I took as we were approaching. The hospital is on the left-hand side, and all of these stores are outside where people are trying to make some extra money. The currency in Kenya is a Kenyan shilling, and 10 US dollars is equal to 1,300 Kenyan shillings. So the monthly salary in Nairobi for the average person is $3.12 a month total. For entry-level employees, it's about 230 US dollars. Mid-career professionals earn about 380 to 750 US dollars per month. And senior level executives can make around just under $1,000 a month. So from perfusion salaries, the annual salary at Tenwek is $900 to $1,300 US dollars, which breaks down to $75 to $100 a month, which is pretty unbelievable. And this is one of the biggest problems we have at Tenwek Hospital. It's a Christian-based hospital, and we train people and we lose them because they can make more money doing perfusion at other centers. I think there's been an agreement now that the students that graduate from our perfusion training program now are obligated to work at Tenwek for 3 years. So we've got 3 full-time staff people now. Mercy just joined on after her graduation, so now we have 4, and they're training 2 to 3 different perfusionists annually. So I think we got the perfusion piece handled, luckily. So as Bob mentioned in his talk, rheumatic heart disease is the primary cardiac diagnosis in this area of sub-Saharan Africa. Rheumatic heart failure is a preventable disease in developed nations, as shown by these results in Costa Rica and Cuba after they introduced treatment for all clinically suspected streptococcal sore throats in their respective countries. While prophylactic treatment is improving, this sub-Saharan region of Africa has the highest rate of rheumatic heart disease in the world. Without treatment, permanent valve damage occurs, with the mitral valve being most commonly affected, followed by the aortic valve. Almost 3/4 of the cases performed at Tenwek Hospital are single or double valves, mostly due to rheumatic heart disease, a preventable disease process that is a neglected disease of poverty. This is a rheumatic valve that we removed from a teenager at Tenwek. It was completely unrecognizable. So this was our first patient that I did in 2008. His name was Kip. He was an 8-year-old with severe tetralogy of Fallot. I'd never seen a TET patient that was this old before. He spent his entire life squatting to improve blood flow through his pulmonary vasculature. After his surgery, he had to learn how to stand because he had never done so beforehand, and he was too afraid to try it after his surgical repair. We see all variations of congenital heart disease in Kenya since we are unable to do stage repairs. The list here is a typical list done during our visits at Tenwek Hospital. And the children are just precious, as are the families. So I wanted to present the most outrageous case that I ever saw. It happened to be the first year that I was there, and it happened the day before we started before I pumped my first case there. The team always refers to me as a camera guy because I take about 5,000 photos every week that I'm there because I'm just so amazed at the scenery and the culture. So Dr. White came in to the cardiac OR and told me to come into the adjoining OR because he wanted me to see the patient that he got, and he said, "Bring your camera." So I walked in, and this patient, this 21-year-old patient, was laying on the table, and there was something going on his neck, and as I looked closer, he had something, looked like a piece of metal that was protruding from his neck. So I turned to Dr. White, and I said, what happened? What's going on with him? And he just nodded and said, "Look at the x-ray." So he had been shot through the neck with an arrow. And they make their arrowheads in this part of Kenya out of 10-penny nails that are very long. They hammer them flat, fashion the end into an arrow tip, and then you can see the flanges on it so that when the arrow goes in, you cannot pull it out. So the patient had walked with a family member 8 to 10 hours to get to Tenwek Hospital, and I was amazed I don't think he's ever worn a pair of shoes. This was the arrowhead that we removed from the patient. We were able to get it out by pushing it through in the direction that the arrow was shot. And I followed up on this patient in the ICU every day just to see how he was doing. Luckily, the arrowhead didn't hit any vascular structures or didn't hit his spine. We were able to get it out, but he expired 3 days later because if the arrow doesn't kill you, they dip it in Roundup so that you get a systemic infection and die from the infection, and that's what happened to him. This was a picture of an arrow on safari that the natives were guarding us from the wildlife while we stayed at the safari. Pretty crazy. So one of the most exciting developments in our program at Tenwek over the past 16 years is the construction of a brand new cardiothoracic center. The structure was made possible through a $40 million grant from Samaritan's Purse and donations through our other Tenwek nonprofit programs. This picture was taken about a year ago. They built it out in the middle of the tea fields in Kenya. That's their major crop. It's just a gorgeous surrounding and backdrop. And as Bob had mentioned, this center will include 6 cardiac operating rooms, including a hybrid OR, 2 cardiac cath labs, 32 ICU beds, 170 overall beds, and a very large endoscopy unit. We'll be treating patients with heart disease and other surgical diseases of the chest, such as esophageal cancer, lung infections like tuberculosis, and fungal infections. Tenwek will be able to offer services that are not available anywhere else in the region. And I'm going back to Tenwek in January, and I hope to do cases at this new facility then. So finally, the best way to end a really long 1 or 2 weeks of working at Tenwek is to go on safari in the Masai Mara. It's an incredible experience that I go on every time I have an opportunity to visit Africa. These are just a few of the videos from safaris that I've been on over the years, where we get to be up close and personal with the Maasai wildlife. We also get to see rhinos, leopards, lions, wildebeest, hyenas, crocodiles, jackals, impalas, antelope, and if we're lucky, we get to see a little bit of carnage along the way. So this entire Eastern Africa experience is an opportunity of a lifetime that I highly recommend that anybody take advantage of if you have the opportunity. So I think most of us agree that we choose a perfusion career as a profession because we all want to make a difference in the lives of others and to give back. And if you've ever participated in a mission trip before, if you never have, you really need to consider doing it because it takes productivity, usefulness, and making a difference to the next level. While Eastern Kenya is the most beautiful and spectacular place I've ever been, it's also the most underprivileged and desolate areas with the most gracious and amazing people who desperately need our help. Looking back on the past 16 years I've spent traveling to and from Eastern Kenya, I feel like I've benefited more than the patients that I've been exposed to and helped. Thank you.